game over or game changing? Why software development may never be the same again. Please welcome Steve Poole.
Thank you. Oh, look, good. Oh, this is exciting. I didn't realize it was such a big room. Years ago, I went to India, and I was asked to do a fireside chat with this chairman of this company. Got off the plane, and they said, through those double doors, and I walked through the double doors, like over there, and I went into a space that wasn't a fireside space. It was about, I don't know, 4 times as big as this, and it was full of people, and they had chairs down the front and people sitting in the aisles, and I'm completely jet-lagged, and all I'm just going, okay. So I feel a little bit like that, because it's good to get back on the big stage. So I was a bit put out by having to do that so suddenly. This talk is meant to scare you, so I hope you will walk away from here having learned something and got your feelers out. We're going to talk about why the world is changing and how it's going to affect us, and I'm going to try and give you some advice as to what you can do next. All right. So it's about cybercrime. It's how the world that we knew is changing, and has changed rapidly in the last, 18 months, 2 years. We're going to touch on something that is being used as the first vehicle to help us begin to figure out how to deal with the issues, which is a US government initiative. And then we'll explore what that means for us and what you can do next and what you can your basic takeaways. So we want to talk about cybercrime. So this is how it works, right? One day, you come in, and whether you're remote or whether you actually have the luxury of being physically in the office, you turn up, and files won't open. You get some call from your user going, I can't open my spreadsheet. You know, if you're in IT, you're doing that. Weird things happen. And then it gets worse because systems won't boot. You get peculiar errors, system errors. Things are just failing, missing DLLs. These are the sorts of peculiar signs. And then as you start to get into it, you begin to understand that there are weird files turning up on your file system. Here is a collection of some names, there are a lot more than this, of file suffixes. You might start to get a hint as to what's going on with this stuff. And then maybe you can't even sign into a system. Maybe you just try to get in, impossible. You are locked out. But more likely, even if that happens to a lot of people, somewhere you will find some information. And this is little file set. Doesn't really matter whether you can read it or not. You think you begin to get the gist. Is a bunch of very specific instructions because you're the victim of ransomware. It's got into your system. And there are very specific instructions, of course, about what to do and what not to do and how to pay. Because it's very easy to pay because you use some anonymous cyber cryptocurrency, and if you're really lucky, the bad guys will unlock the data for you. If you're less lucky, they will unlock your data for you, and then you'll find that you've been encrypted a second time, and now you're going to pay up another go, because once you've paid up once, you're going to pay up a second time. If you're really unlucky, nothing will happen. You will pay, and nothing will happen. If you get hit by ransomware, if your company gets hit by ransomware, currently, the chance of your company surviving beyond that are pretty low. Right? It's bad. And we're going to talk more about this, but this is where we are. Okay? So I said there's somewhere there was a link to paying for cryptocurrency because it's almost untraceable. Occasionally we can catch a bad guy because they did something stupid, but mostly they get away with it. Now the process for getting in, because ransomware is just one way they're going to make money out of you, but the process of getting in and what they do is very similar to in all the sorts of attacks, right? And I have this silly diagram, but basically it starts off with phishing, social attacks, because ideally we want to get to the people in your organization that will be unwittingly willing to insert malware. Okay, and believe me, that can be you just as much as it can be somebody in one of your, I don't know, accounts departments, whatever. It's not what you think. So basically you get phished, you get some really tiny payload malware that gets installed, and then there's a whole bunch of malware frameworks out there that you can make use of. There's even ransomware as a service. You can either pay other people to do this for you. But eventually what happens is various types of malware payload frameworks get installed and they do their business. Okay? So I said it's not your usual phishing because as developers, we're used to one type of phish, and it's this sort of thing. You know, you get something that says, hey, I have this ATM card and it's got $10 billion on it, and if you give me some money, I'll give you this card. And there's all that, you know, we know the sob story, and you look at these things and you go, I can spot that it's a scam. Maybe the Zenith Bank of Nigeria at the bottom might give it away, but just the wording. Here's another one, the same thing, you know. I like this one because it says so in the middle about things were retained for their selfish reasons. You know, you wouldn't fall for this, would you? The point is, you wouldn't fall for this or the one before because it's not aimed at you. These guys, the people who are doing this, are trying to find the greedy, gullible, stupid people. Why have a conversation with a smart person if you're trying to defraud them? You want somebody who's more greedy than they're smart. So that's why you have these sorts of stupid things. Only needs one. No, you're more likely to suffer from something a bit more sophisticated, something aimed at you personally, something aimed that's crafted by what you've said on social media. So a classic will be, again, this isn't necessarily you as a developer, but it could be somebody in your company, but it will be aimed, it'll be targeted. So the classic is that these people will follow what you say on Facebook or whatever, and you share with your friends that you don't like your boss or you're frightened of your boss or whatever, or there's some bad relationship, and then this can happen. Something comes through that looks right, but smells a bit, but because you're frightened, you do what's said, what's asked for. That's the sort of thing they'll do. Right? Here's another one. This is, I mean, it's just a picture, but literally the bad guys know your industry. They know your business. They know how it works. They are very smart, and they will craft very, very specific payloads. So this is an example where an email was sent. It's a waste slip for shipping. The people who crafted it knew exactly how the business worked, created it, sent it to the people they knew were going to be the busiest. They run it, it's a zip file, malware gets in, and they're done, right? So one thing you have to start learning about this space is that it's not as random as you might think, and it is transferring from the sort of drive-by attacks that we were used to, which was just like, oh, you've left the door open on your system and they get in, to much more focused attacks. Right. So they are targeting particular industries in different ways. Depending on what the business is, they have different styles of attack. Okay? Depending on what business you're in, you'll be attacked differently. Right. And they are personalized. They will look at how you react with your peers, what you talk about. All sorts of possible information is available, and they will steal that information. Steal it, it's publicly available. They'll take that information and make use of it in the crafted attack they're going to get into you. So that's one way they get in. That's by coming through your lack of attention, your ability to, or inability to spot that somebody's trying to do one of these things. But there's also the other ways, the obvious things, like massive vulnerabilities in lots of the software. Bear in mind, the only thing between you and the bad guys is software. There's no anything else. The only thing between your system and their system, your system and anybody else's system, is software. And software always gets vulnerabilities because that's just life. So they will target these. They'll get into the network systems. They'll get into the routers. They'll use them as stepping stones. Very sophisticated attacks. And they're also moving up. So now, where we used to have, I said, the sort of drive-by attack that we had, which was almost like random, they want to get out of that, and they're looking at getting into the people you connect to. Obviously, can I connect to another system so I can attack you? But can I also get into the supply chain? So can I attack the companies that are producing firmware that goes into the routers or the printers? Can I go downstream? So if any of you have ever watched any of the sort of, the Ocean's 11 type films, where they have all these scams, and there's one particular, if you remember, they go back to Mexico and they do something to the dice so that they can then win the game. That's what the bad guys are trying to do. They're trying to go to the places that you trust implicitly to inserting their malware and their backdoors and stuff like that. Right? And coupled to all of this is not just those sorts of things. There are all the other big vulnerabilities, the ones that we know about, the log4js, the spring for shells, things like this. These big ones, these are obvious, right? And the reason that these are useful, because ultimately, however they're doing this, whatever payload process they have, they're trying to do this, remote code execution. That's what they're after. Because if I can run arbitrary code on your system, then I can do whatever I want to it. Right, so fundamentally, that's what they're after. They have other aims, but that gives them full access to whatever. Okay. So whether it's ransomware or whatever, they'll use this. But ransomware, they get into your systems, and then magic happens, because then they start calling out. So remember, the payload is going to be as small as they can get away with. They don't put gigabytes on your system. They want to put a little bit in, and then they'll make calls out, and they bring stuff in. So they go and get some encryption keys. Obviously, you need those. And then they have a whole bunch of techniques. They're working out how to encrypt your system, and they're not going to do it in a random way. They look at what files are being used. What should we encrypt? What files have been loaded in memory? Encrypt those first, because you're not using them. You won't spot them. What's the least file you use? Let's encrypt that and do all that sort of stuff. So that's sophisticated enough. And then the ways that they get data out is even more sophisticated, because they will piggyback on holes in protocols. They'll make HTTP requests. There are instances of them finding weaknesses in your application server, and rather using it to corrupt your system, they just piggyback on it and send data out. And bear in mind, they're not sending data to one IP address. They're sending data to a big botnet. So you wouldn't notice it, other than these calls are going out to random IP addresses. And it could also be, as it says, sometimes the botnet is probing your compromised system deliberately to allow them to tack on some data they want to send off, because they want to steal your data as much as they want to encrypt it. And in fact, more than that, they may even want to modify your data. I'll talk about that in a minute. So don't think that these things are simple. They are very sophisticated, well constructed, and in use all the time. Anyway, and you might go, oh, I've heard about this, it's just ransomware. Right? The punchline for this is that ransomware used to be a thing on its own, and now it's become something else. It used to be just for the money, but now it's a demonstration. It's a demonstration because there's something else going on, and if you're attacking people using software, you'd like to know that you're being successful, that you're having an effect. And ransomware is a really good mechanism to see that you've caused sufficient damage in some particular place for somebody to scream about it. So think about that. Because we are now moving from a world where it was about money to a world where it's about nation-state activities. It's about the existence of states. It's become a political activity. So you've seen it already. I'm sure you've seen in the news. There are some thing what goes on, and it's percolating. So they're trying to get into your systems. And I say they, I mean everybody. Every single nation state, everybody who's got some political agenda, somebody who wants to affect your economy, the way that you do, the way that you live, everything. Because software drives everything, doesn't it? We got here, you're all here because you interacted with software. There's not one part of your journey, unless maybe you walked here, right, that involves software. In fact, even if you did walk here, you had to have a badge, and that's software. You know, there's no way. Software is everywhere. So it runs our lives, and people have realized that. So they want to get into the obvious things like your power supplies. They want to get into your generators. They want to get into your supply chains. They want to get into your manufacturing processes. They want to get into the truck systems that deliver to supermarkets. They want to get into the farm systems, because all of this is valuable, because what they might want to do at some point is manipulate or terminate those systems. So the attack type that we had, which is still going on, by the way, the attack type of the old cybercrime, which is for money, and then they might try and be stealthy because they're trying to steal things from you, but at some point they're doing it just for money. We're now moved to this new world where it's for with different motivations. And those motivations involved not being caught and being very stealthy about it. Right? Now, again, it's like, well, okay, so this is happening. What does it mean? Well, let me give you some numbers. Right. So I'm going to show you a chart, and the green line that you're going to see is the amount of money that we estimate the drug trade, the illicit drug trade, costs the world, how much money they make on a year-by-year basis. The red line is the cost that cybercrime costs the world, right? How much money do these bad guys make out of this? So just look what happens. Ooh. So for some time, cybercrime and the drug trade were about the same, $450 billion. But what has happened recently is that it started to escalate and gone through the roof. Does that sound bad? Yeah, okay. $6 trillion, that was the top number you saw. That's just how much they make out of ransomware. There are estimates floating around that the total value to the bad guys is somewhere between 20 and $30 trillion, which is about the same as the US's annual GDP. Right? It's about 2% of all the money in the world. So not about GDP, about all the assets, the wealth the whole world has. They look like they're able to steal about 2% of that value yearly. Because it is, and you can now see why this is such a lucrative business for everybody. And you can also see, because it's so easy for these guys to make money, how much of an opportunity it is for nation states to use these as vectors to get in to attack your economy. Right? So we're now looking at new ways of, we just blown the old world out of the way. It still goes on. You still can't get away from that, but it's state-funded, very well-trained professional people. And maybe some here, because they come to conferences, they're developers. So well-funded, regularly exercised, of course, you'll have read about it, but every time you see a ransomware attack, it may just be a test to see whether that payload process works. Very sophisticated. I gave you a hint of how far they're going to go to get into the systems. These guys will go upstream. They will go to open source projects. They will find ways to influence those in such a way to get the back doors in that they want so they can do this stuff. Right? And you may not spot it because you're thinking about what you're trying to achieve, what your motivations, what you need, and they're coming in completely differently and they're in for the long game. And of course, it makes loads of money. And ironically, if you get attacked and you pay off a ransomware, you could actually be just funding the next set of attacks. Okay. So this is where we are. Weaponized cybercrime. It's the new reality. It is bubbling up. It's being proven to work. And it doesn't necessarily have to be super visible to you. Right? It doesn't mean that somebody has to declare war. No, it's just going to be used by nation states to influence you, to get you to change your opinions, to deliver fake news, to affect your systems, to get in there and make your trains run slower, or make, I don't know, make the deliveries to the supermarkets just slightly worse, to disaffect you, to make your economy less useful, less powerful. And this is where we are now. This is the new world that's beginning to emerge. I told you this is scary. Okay. So what's that going to do with developers? Well, unfortunately, what we now have is a bunch of bad guys who want to influence us, and they are nasty people. But we are nice people because we're open source. And open source has this whole altruistic thing about what we do for each other. It's not completely true because there are always fights, but ultimately open source is this fabulous thing which we all use, and very little of the thinking that you need to have now that we're in this work mode is in those open source projects. Let me show you to talk about it differently. You have some application, right? I'm pretty certain that whatever you do, whatever application you're involved in producing, there will be open source. It could be just the Linux thing you're running on, but it will probably be the frameworks and the tools and everything is open source because they're free and they do the job and they're well supported. The net is that about 90% of a modern Java application isn't written by you because you've levered all these other capabilities. So only about 10% of yours is open source. Of yours is your code. The rest is open source, right? And the amount of open source that's out there is just ridiculous. I mean, 3 million projects. So you can see the different numbers, but 3 million projects, 37 million versions, trillions of downloads. We live and breathe open source. It is how we do what we do. It's how we're productive. It's how we deliver value, right? And so that open source world that we live in, it's all built on trust. We just consume this stuff, and it's growing. It is going through the roof. The open source development that we had 10 years ago is just because so many people are creating open source. And it's not just Java. You pick your programming languages, there's loads of stuff out there, right? So 2025, 20 trillion downloads a year. That's an enormous amount of downloads of stuff. There's all that open source that we rely on, that we're growing because it's just so much easier. We're all, there are many people who are learning to be contributors and they're committing code and making it available. So that's all very good. But unfortunately, this is the target space that the bad guys want to get to because they're going upstream, they're being sophisticated. Can I get into your project? Can I get into the source code of the dependencies that you use? Can I change them? Can I compromise them? Now, it used to be that they look for CVEs. And hopefully you understand what the CVE thing signifies. It's a report of a vulnerability. And for many years, the objective by the bad guys was mostly to just wait. They have researchers, just like everybody does, looking for them, looking for vulnerabilities. But they mostly waited. And a big one would turn up and, and then they'd exploit it. But that's not what they do now. Sorry, they still do that. But I add to that list a bunch of other things that are going on. And you can go Google for these terms, but basically, once you start thinking about how you might compromise somebody, there's some various obvious things. So typo squatting is where I register a dependency that's almost the same spelling as the one that you rely on. And so that time when you typed it in and you add it into your POM or into your package.js or whatever, and you spout it just slightly wrong, there may actually be one existent, so that when you go to install it, it's there. You've chosen the wrong one. You've got bad software in. Now, the other side of this table, there's dependency confusion, which is very similar, which is very much about you not quite understanding how the dependency process works and somebody registering latest or some big high number of a version, and you've got latest, and what do you get? You don't get the latest that you think you should get, you get the latest that somebody else has registered. Now, depending on what ecosystem you're in, these are better or worse. Java's got, Java in the Maven space, we have some good controls, but these things are possible. Then the two in the middle, open source repo attacks is sort of what I've been saying. This is them socially engineering that I'm going to come and help you. I'm going to be a new contributor. I'm going to help you do a merge. And somebody says, thank you very much. And then they don't check to see whether the merge that's happened has actually merged the pull requests as expected, or whether some extra code got in. Because we rely on people to do good stuff for us, right? And they are beginning to exploit our trust in those spaces. And the build tool attacks, well, it turns out that developers are producing open source, quite a lot of them don't actually think about putting security around their build processes, and so it becomes either very easy to trigger them, which is a weakness, or actually what they'll try and do, the bad guys will try and get in there sort of near the end. So you can do whatever you want, and then the binary that gets constructed at the end, well, they manage to just get there and add some malware in. That's what they're trying to do, and they will target you. Right. So let me put it differently. Let's go back to this payroll thing. So you've got this payroll. 90% of the code that you use comes from somebody else, your dependencies, right? So they used to look for those vulnerabilities, but, well, now they're adding their own. They're going not just to the dependencies, they're targeting the runtimes, the tools, the compilers, the platforms. Anywhere they can get in, they will do so. Because every step they're away from your eyes, everywhere they're part of a chain down the road that you've already trusted, then there's less likely to be detected. That's their objective. It's long-term thinking. Okay? Right? And they're doing this not to be seen, because they're positioning themselves for longer-term reasons. And so many of these will be hidden, and they'll just go off when they're needed. And ideally, they'll go off in ways that you won't even notice. So unfortunately, our trust in open source has got to change. It is beginning to evaporate. People are beginning to appreciate the challenges that we have. 5% of the projects on Maven Central have a vulnerability of a 9 or a 10. So they're always there. That's always going to be true. There's always vulnerabilities. But now they're adding in more ways to get into your systems, right? More ways of compromising you as individuals, more ways of compromising your open source projects, more ways of compromising the open source projects that your projects depend on. Right? That's what's going on. Now, it's early days, but you can see by the numbers that it's very lucrative, and it's not going to stop unless we do something about it. The golden goose is this supply chain thing. This idea that you have software, your company does something, so I want to get into your supply chain. We're all part of supply chain. Whatever we're doing it for a reason. Even if you're working in for charity basis, there's always a reason. You're always part of a supply chain. You always know somebody else. You always give something to somebody. You always take something, and you're part of a supply chain. And so the specific attacks on supply chains that we can measure have gone up, as you can see, 650% in the last couple of years, because it's become the target space. Right? Now, let me add some more fear to you. We used to talk about the length of time you had between a vulnerability being reported and how long you had before you could fix it. And it used to be measured way back. it used to be like, was it 2005? 45 days, total luxury. Vulnerability reported, you have over a month to apply a fix with the certainty that you probably wouldn't get attacked in that period of time, because the bad guys took that long to attack you. That number has gone down, 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 down. We got down to Struts 2, 2017 or whatever it was, and it was like down to like 2 days. And Log4j came out and demonstrated that, well, actually, it's closed. Log4j is a vulnerability. You all know about Log4j. Came out on the 9th of December. And in the right circumstances, it allows you to run arbitrary code on somebody else's server fairly trivially. Perfect gift to the bad guys. It's been there since 2014. In fact, other people in the security industry have reported the fact that this thing existed, but the Java community sort of closed their eyes to it. The fact is that this window doesn't exist anymore. You have no time, because we have people who are actively trying to find these vulnerabilities. We have people who are being paid large amounts of money to discover them, right? So finding bugs, vulnerabilities, which used to be sort of a research project, is now a well-funded activity. You get paid really well for finding bugs, and you can get paid more for not reporting them. We have multiple instances of $10 million or plus being paid to somebody who's found a bug, so it's not reported. Because you can imagine, $10 million for Log4j, and the ability that it would give you as a nation state is peanuts. So that's what's beginning to happen. These things are being suppressed. Right? Some countries are going even further and saying, you can't report them the way you used to. You have to report them to us first, because they may be valuable. So the world is changing in the way that we dealt with these things. Right? And the more severe the problem is when it's discovered, the less chance it has of being reported immediately, depending on who found it. So you've got to now start thinking that all the things that people say to you about, oh, you've got time, or your IT team say, we'll apply this dependency and we'll do it next week, or we'll do it a month, because that's when we've got these things scheduled. The simple answer is, as soon as a major vulnerability is announced, the chances are it's already being exploited. So we're moving to this sort of world now. It's exploit first. So you have to start looking very much at how you develop software, how your build processes work, how your deployment processes work, because of this. This one, behind me, yes. All right. We are moving towards that world. Remember, the bad guys that used to do cybercrime, they're still around. But now we have more interested and more well-funded and more thoughtful attackers. So, what has happened? What have we done? We've acknowledged all this, and now it'd be like, well, what's going on to fix it? Well, what do you do? Well, when you look at this problem and you go, it's a sort of just a commercial problem, then not very little. I mean, very little happens. We've spent years talking about the fact that this thing happens. I'm here talking about this because once upon a time I was just a Java developer. I worked for IBM for years doing JVMs, and I would have ignored all this. But I stopped for a bit, and I ran a DevOps team for a few years, a big DevOps team, and so suddenly cybercrime became important, and I understood what was going on. But it was still a commercial problem. But as you can see, as you know, the transition to using these attacks for warfare purposes, for these sorts of trying to cripple your economy, different story entirely. So, last year, there was an executive order from Joe Biden, right? Okay, so what did he say? Well, the first thing they agreed was that they should recognize that this was going on, so that actually people began to understand that it was important. Now, the fact that the US have done this, and they had a bunch of meetings with all the high-tech companies involved, But the fact the US has done this just means that we're at, day one of this. Other countries are looking at this and will join in because it's going to make sense. So it's, hey, this needs to be fixed. And so, well, how do you do this? What does the government do to force people to change their behavior? Well, they have monetary options, or they start passing laws. Well, they've done a bit of both, really. Right now, the first thing they've said is that by a particular date, which we'll touch on in a minute, if you want to sell software to the US government, any of the organizations, you will need to fulfill their requirements. Okay? And those requirements are going to change the way we do software. No doubt about it. Because there's a lot of them. The first thing they're going to ask you to do is to provide what's called an SBOM. I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. But if you look at the words that I've got up there, you begin to get a sense of what's going on. So they're talking about automatic. No human beings are allowed to be part of a build process. Once it's initiated, which you can do, the process from that to whatever is the final artifact will be required to be automatic. Because any point where a human being gets involved is a possibility of bad things happening, or more bad things happening. And it's no good you going, yeah, I've done that, we've got automatic. They're going to say, prove it. Provide me the evidence of your software integrity. Demonstrate that you have audit processes, that you yourself are checking these things, and everything's working for you. Right? Lots of evidence, automation terms. You have a vulnerability disclosure program, so that when somebody reports something about your software, they know how to report it, and you know how to deal with it, because otherwise you have confusion. And did they report that? Did they not? So the government's going, no, you've got to be in control of this, right? And then it's not just about your software. It's about 90% of the software that you're consuming. That's all got to do this too. Because you can't provide a bill of materials, the SBOM, that says that you've done a good job unless somehow your suppliers have also done a good job. And you can see where that's heading, right? Anyway, and then demonstrate strong controls. Well, basically, lock everything down, prove that you have a solid, reliable, repeatable, automatic process for delivering software, right? That's where this is heading. Now, the SBOMs are these things in the middle. There are two standards reference. One's called CycloneDX, which is an XML-based one, which is designed specifically for bill of materials. And the other one is SPDX, which is probably a term you may have heard before around software licensing. That spec is being expanded. It doesn't matter which one you pick, somebody else will pick the other, so both of these will be involved. And tooling is already beginning to percolate that allows you to produce SBOMs from your build processes all over the place. Okay? SBOM is sort of like the document in the middle. It's not intended to be a document that gathers everybody's things together, but think of it more like a network of URLs with digital signatures, etc., to prove that everything is correct and hasn't been falsified. That's where they want to go. Right? And one of the reasons for the SBOM is because of the way that we currently look for vulnerabilities. Right now, whatever vulnerability scanning tools you do, it's a scanner. It looks at the stuff you have, and depending how smart it is, it works out what you've got. Some tools are good, some tools are bad, some tools are very bad, some tools are very good. But whatever happens, they scan the thing that you have. SBOMs don't do that. SBOMs flip that conversation, right? So what was I going to say? I think I said this, yeah. Yeah, so currently your tools, your scanning tools are going to work on the end result, right? And that relies on transparency. And that means that you know that if I've included, that my tool can find that dependency. So that dependency has to have constructed itself in such a way that this tool can scan it, et cetera, okay? And the problem with that is that they can be opaque, because I could build my dependency that you're using, the jar file in it, may not be built. It may be a fat jar. So I pulled stuff in, and I've hidden all the fat that I've got log4j in there. So therefore, your dependency tool, your scanning tools have to spot that. So you have all that sort of like, is it or is it not? Okay. And of course, bad guys get involved in this as well. So not only may it be unintentionally wrong, it may be intentionally wrong because the bad guys have faked this, and hidden things. And if you go look at how log4j was exploited, it wasn't just about dependencies. It was about taking the code that was weak and adding it into other packages and trying to exploit it that way. All sorts of wonderful ways. Right? So the flip is the SBOM says, no, I'm going to tell you what I used. I'm going to tell you what compiler I used and what version it is, and I'm going to tell you what dependencies I've used, and I'm going to tell you what dependencies my dependencies had and all that stuff, because we're building this tree of proof. Right? So that means that the sorts of things we had before, where you have a product at some version, then you have some dependencies, cool, right? Well, that's going to expand, because now you're going to have SBOMs involved in this, and SBOMs are going to have references to somebody else's SBOM, and some signatures and some keys and all those sorts of things. So more information which can be traced and analyzed. Right? So you now have this bigger picture of what your dependency tree looks like, lots of information available to you, which means that the scanning tools don't have to scan, because now what we're talking about is making sure that when something in this thing is discovered to have a vulnerability, it's easy to discover that affects you, because you can track that. Right? And of course, there'll be some sort of reverse process in this. Right? Okay. So you inherit the bombs of all the things that you're using and everything they use and so on all the way down, which is cool. Right? So that means you're more likely to find issues because you know exactly what you've got. You won't miss those edge cases. But also that means that you're going to find more of them because now you know more about what you've got. And as the SBOM process grows, as over time we expand it to cover the things that we know we need to, which we don't yet, like what compilers we use and the Linux OS SBOM and those sorts of things, you're going to find that your application at the top has an SBOM that reaches out, and suddenly an alert's going to go off for something way down the bottom. At least you'll know, but you've got to deal with it. So you can see that's going to make life more complicated for us. Just looking at these things. So the way that you build software is going to change, right? I mean, there's no doubt about that. These government initiatives are going to come through to us. Even if you're not selling software, somebody else is going to want to use you. So you may give your software to somebody else, and they may sell it to a government. You can see how you're going to be connected. Right? And if you're an open source project and you're popular, people are going to be knocking at the door saying, "Can you do this for us?" Okay. The prediction is that as it says, by 2025, everybody who's selling to the government will have to comply with this, which is scary. Everything's got to be automatic. So you need to do all these things. You need to track back, prove, have audit processes, have all this evidence, and of course, it also means that if a vulnerability comes in, you've got to fix it like that. You are not going to have time. So you know what you've got, but now you need to deal with the fact that you're going to get these alerts that tells you have a vulnerability. So you need to be able to fix it, right? Because you're part of this SBOM. And somebody's depending on you. And the further down you go, the more important it is that you can fix that like that, because other people are depending on you. And they will be screaming at you for you to fix these things. So it means moving away from, correct? Yes? Okay, so we're moving away from infrastructure as code to this as everything as code, right? That's where we are with this stuff, right? I need to make a move, right? let me get on to the last bit. You've got to take a good look at the tools that you have. Tools are so important, right? There are many, many tools out there that you can use. I mean, there's thousands of them. You can find all sorts of stuff, and they'll tell you about dependencies and quality. Okay. The problem is that tool space itself is very lucrative because of all this money that's knocking around. So you've got to get away from just choosing tools willy-nilly based on price or because you like it, and make sure you don't pick the snake oil tools. You've got to sit there and go, look, if this tool says it does this, I need to prove it to yourself that it does what it says it does. You've got to check the tool to say, how do they find out? So if they're a scanning tool, where does their intelligence come from? Go ask them. Figure out whether they are getting a small amount of evidence or whether they get a large amount of evidence. That's really important that you evaluate the tools that you're using for their capabilities and their intelligence. Right? And look at tools. And if tools that you use constantly keep saying, hey, we've got a fix and now we can find this new vulnerability, that's not a good sign. If they do it all the time, it's a bad sign because their base tools aren't able to find the basic types of vulnerability. They're having to craft something every time. Something else to think about, right? So I'd say, even if you use the best tools in the world, let's move on, you've got to start applying the smarts. Right? Log4Shell has shown, this is Maven Central downloads, that even right now, even when it's several months after we all tried to fix it, we've still got 40% of downloads from Maven Central are for poor versions, vulnerable versions of Log4j. We're not very good at this. We're relying on tools that we think are telling us that everything's okay, and there's a good chance they're not. So simply, these are the best tools to use. Your brain, your nose, your eyes. Okay, well, your nose, right? There's a whole bunch of rules, and I will skip this slide because you can go look this up. But if you think about it, now I want you to think about how you select dependencies based not just on the features, but also on other things. What their licensing looks like, what their vulnerability process looks like. Do they take security seriously? What's their level of quality? You need to start using your head and your nose and your eyes to start looking at the dependencies that you choose, not just for the feature that they provide you, but also for these non-functional characteristics of how well can they deal with situations that are coming. Do they understand it? Can they deal with it? Can you trust them? Okay. All right. So this is obviously hard. There's loads of stuff going on, right? Because we've got to do all of it's not just our pipelines, it's everybody's, right? Okay, so let me skip through because I am really running out of time. Okay, I want you to take away this. The bad guys are out there, they are fully enabled, they are going to make use of every way they can to get into your systems. We are beginning to change. Fundamentally, the best way we can change is by you changing your behavior and taking this second look at the open source that you consume and look at how you create better tooling to apply vulnerability patches as soon as possible. Those two things will make an enormous difference to the way that your system is protected, because those are the ways that you're going to get exploited. Okay, right? So I'll leave you with the takeaways. We are changing. The world that we knew 2 years ago is just gone. Really sorry, but we have a new world, and everything comes around us being able to be prepared to provide evidence that we are doing the right thing. And it's about us choosing open source projects differently and more wisely. And fundamentally, when you get down to getting involved in tools and selecting tools, you've got to be wiser there too. The trust that you have had in open source and the developer community and the tools community has got to be moving from blind trust to provable trust, because that's where we are. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Any questions? Do I have time for questions? Sorry, I could talk about this. Well, I do talk about this for days. I'm around for the rest of the day of the conference, and then unfortunately I have to go. So if you want to ask me questions, just find me and come and chat. Otherwise, just again, thank you very much.